Tyranny of the Hatt by Liam Campbell and Clara Lucas. Log 17. All eyes on Diesel. Maxine Carberry, Thomas's driver, stood atop a pile of crates. She hopped around precariously, yelling into a megaphone. Marcel, Thomas's stoker, was making a good head of steam for him. Thomas whooshed and clanked, blowing steam crossly in all directions. Gordon's crew, who had been laid off, come back to fire their engine up one last time. The big engine had a good amount of steam, but it was nothing in comparison to Thomas. Workmen rallied at Maxine's words. They clapped and cheered as she rambled. "Our home is turning into British Isles. Let's throw out this beach and get buff and save a railway."
"I didn't realize how good she was at this,"
whispered Gordon. Thomas chuckled. She used to do this all the time in the 60s. She was a civil rights advocate. She even went to the Stonewall riots.
Advocate.
Same thing. Bruno watched from the platform. He quickly noticed that Thomas and Gordon were fouling the points, blocking all traffic from coming in and out of the station. He sat on a bench, picking up an abandoned newspaper. The headline read, "NWR in Tyranny." Bruno wasn't surprised, but continued to read. Occasionally, he would glance up from the paper to the station. Engines would be blocked off from entering the station. Thomas would quickly explain the strike and then open the yard entrance for them. The engines would then slip into the yards and then into the sheds. Fed-up passengers, with nothing else to do, decided to take the bus or other means. Occasionally, a few would walk over to the workmen and join them. Over time, more and more engines came. Murdoch and a large group of workmen entered the sheds. Thomas was cheerfully letting James in when Duck came screeching in, followed by Diesel and Edward. "Duck, I'm glad you can make it. I knew you'd like to join in."
"Something needs to be done about this man."
"You're telling me. Why is he here?"
"You, Diesel?"
"The one and only."
"I have a mouth that I can talk with, thank you."
"Okay, so Diesel, why are you here?"
"Your Stephen has decided to take me out of service and scrap me."
"Oh, wait, that's actually not funny."
"What were you expecting?"
"I don't know. You broke down, so Doug had to drag you here and..." "Edward? Oh, Godred, this is really bad, isn't it?" Thomas quickly jumped off the points, letting the three engines in. It wasn't long before most of not just the mainline engines, but numerous branch line engines, NWR or private, joined them. After 2 hours of slowly reading the paper over and over, Bruno went to check on Stephen. Stephen was in his office with his map table of the island. He was shoving engines all over it, resembling the ones that worked on his railway. Or did at one point. An A3 and Hornby model of the Flying Scotsman that had been sloppily painted in NWR blue had been cast aside in the middle of the Irish Sea. Stephen painted his stapler in yellow and blue akin to Philippa and Emmeline. A cheap 440 plastic toy and Hornby pannier had the same treatment as the A3. Small black cardboard boxes replaced them on their respective branch lines. Stephen pushed engines around with a dice carp stick. A radio was blasting music from within his office as Stephen loudly sang to it.
"Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes."
The song cut out. Stephen paused and looked to the radio, where Brumel stood, proud and tall, holding the tape, now removed from the cassette.
"Brumel, what are you doing?"
Brumel held up his fingers to his mouth, gesturing for silence, then pointed to his ears.
"I've heard. I've been hearing. Thought I put on some classics while waiting for my friend to come before I go yell at them," he snickered.
"Friend?" Just then, bursting through the door was Bart Simmons. "Sir Stephen, it's a pleasure to be here," he cheered, holding luggage and suitcases in his hands and tucked under his armpits. He had just stepped through the threshold of the doorway and slept on a toy Thomas. He spilled all his belongings onto the floor.
"Mr. Simmons," chortled Stephen, walking over and embracing Bart in a handshake. "Brumel, I'd like you to meet my new assistant, Mr. Simmons."
"New?"
"Yes. Oh, by the way, you're fired."
Bruno sighed. He knew this would have come eventually. "Oh, by the way, there's an angry mob outside."
"Oh yes, I forgot about that. Time to deal with it," he sniffed, turning to Bart.
"Right so. They're a nuisance, those steam engines are. I still have a ringing in my ears from those whistles as I got off the bus."
"Yes, quite,"
replied Stephen as he looked over at the map, smirking deviously at it. He inspected the line that was the Farquhar branch of engines strewn across the table. He bent down and picked up his little stumpy metal blue engine from the floor of which Bart had slipped on. The bottom of it read Ertl with a paper face glued onto it. He smirked and picked it up. He toyed with it in his hands, throwing it back and forth. It suddenly fell out and landed on its wheels into the town of Farquhar before rolling over to the area of the Peel Godred Ironworks. Stephen snickered as he picked the toy back up before chucking it across the room. It thudded against the wall as it fell onto the floor. It was covered in scrapes and scratches and a bent running board. Stephen snickered as he and Bart left his office. Gordon and Thomas made their way inside the shed. Thomas sat in the middle of the turntable with Maxine standing on his tank, shouting into her megaphone, "We want a new controller!" Engines whistled and wheezed in agreement as workmen repeated her. Engines crowded into multiple berths, all murmuring and talking about what a disgraceful railway it was. "What indignation is this? 40? 50? Asked James to Gordon.
This is no indignation meeting, my dear James. This is a strike.
Stephen stood outside the shed, looking on into it grimly. With a deep sigh, he and Bart made their way in. He stood in the entrance with the sun beaming down behind him. He drew a long shadow onto the turntable where Thomas stood. All engines and workmen stood firm and silent as they stared at him. All eyes laid on Stephen. Duck and Diesel sat quietly beside each other, with Bill and Ben shoved behind them. They dared not to make a noise at the moment, even though, right before Stephen had walked in, they were making sure their voices were being heard by everyone.
I have come to tell you all that I have sold one of you off for scrap.
No response came, except for a small call from a platelayers who sat far in the back. "And who is it, sir?" Finally came a response, a very hesitant Percy.
I have decided to sell number 1.
There was a slight murmur from the engines. Thomas, meanwhile, stared dumbfounded at Stephen. "Nice one. Anyways, what do you really want from us?" Thomas asked with fake confidence, looking at the other engines for reassurance.
You are to be moved to the out-of-use siding for the time being. The Iron Twins will come and take you away soon for you to be melted down this week.
Thomas slowly processed the information in a smoke box. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It wasn't true. No, obviously it wasn't. It was all a ruse. It was just all some practical joke. A dream, obviously. That's why he felt so tired. And that's why everything felt blurry. That's why his ashtray had just dropped. But alas, it wasn't. "You're joking, right?" asked Thomas. Everything felt light, but at the same time, heavy as well. He didn't feel like he was awake anymore. None of this felt real. Him being sentenced to death this week.
Yes. Now, number 2, please shunt number 1 to the out-of-use siding.
Thomas laughed maniacally, gaining some confidence. Edward stared blankly at Stephen.
Number 2, please do as I asked,
declared Stephen again. A scoff arose from the little old engine. "No, thank you."
Excuse me?
"No, I don't think I will."
You dare defy me?
"I've been left in that siding for the last several months. I'm currently incapable of helping with your, God should forgive me, idiotic behavior. Taking Gordon off the express, removing Doug from his branch, and now scrapping my brother. He will not break our family apart. Now please be a dear and leave our sheds." He had asked so politely, it felt wrong not to subside to the engine. It sounded like his father had just said it, not some metal machine. It was life-changing to them all. But Edward, no matter what, kept his composure. Something in Stephen told him to turn around, forget all of this, and let services resume. But Bart nudged him on. Stephen's skin curled. The silence in the shed boomed thunderously against his ears. He was stuck in place in some imaginary game with Edward of who would cut eye contact first. It was Stephen who lost as he turned himself away.
Number 4. You move number 1.
Gordon didn't pay mind to him. Instead, he rolled his eyes and resumed his conversation with Henry just a moment prior.
As I was saying, there's no more good management around here. Number 6.
But the little engine blew steam crossly at the man.
Number 7, 3, 11, James!
But his engines ignored him. He turned to the private engines.
Fergus, Bill, Ben!
But they all started yelling. Suck it! Laughed Jem. The husk of what used to be an authoritarian man stood in front of them. He meant nothing to them anymore. He turned to his diesels. They would help him. Of course they would. He had been trying to make everything better for them. Surely.
Boko!
Addressed Stephen. Belko smiled cheerfully.
Be a good engine, and
A growl arose from Bear beside him, blowing fumes at Stephen. He coughed and choked on the fumes. Through the smog, he saw the two grinning. His brow fell.
D3579! Escort number 1 out of the shed!
Thomas is my friend. I'm not hurting him, and my name is Paxton.
Your name is D3579 until I say it isn't. Now listen to me, or you can go with him as well.
Don't you dare! Roared Diesel, exhaust sputtering from his engine. All eyes laid on him now, as the shed went quiet. Stephen smirked as the sound of welding arose as smelting tools flickered from the men who were trying to mend Diesel.
Diesel, purred Stephen. Please move number 1 to the out-of-view siding. If you do, I will allow you to continue running your passenger service.
The Diesel looked at Stephen up and down, judging every feature of him. I don't think I will, purred Diesel at last.
Pardon?
You're a deranged man. You think everything you've done to me and Duck makes all of this okay. He paused impressively. You'll never be like your father. Stephen said no more. Listen here, N! Squeaked Bart, but Stephen clashed his hand over his mouth, shutting him up. The two exited the shed and back to his office. And upwards of whistles and cheers blared from the shed for Diesel as boos and hisses arose for Stephen.